and welcome. I am Daniela Bleichmar. I am the director of the Levan Institute for the Humanities. Welcome to today's workshop, workshop on how to respond to peer review. We do invite everyone to turn on their cameras if possible. It's much nicer for the speakers and for everyone to see actual humans if possible. It is my pleasure today to welcome our presenters. One of them is having some technical difficulties, so we will start with those who are here. Joining us today are Sergio Sismondo, professor of philosophy at Queen's University and an editor of social studies of science, and Jessica Wolfe, who is a Marcel Bataillon professor of English and comparative literature at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, and a former editor of Renaissance Quarterly. We very much hope that our third speaker will be able to join us very soon. That is Seamus Khan, professor of sociology and American studies at Princeton University and a former editor of Public Culture. And our presenters will not be speaking as representatives of the journal or on behalf of the journal, but simply as very experienced editors about the question of how to respond to peer review. We will have about half an hour of comments. They have been asked to speak briefly on important topics, and then we will have about 25 minutes for questions, which I will moderate. I am forgetting who was going to speak first. Sergio, Jessica.
I think on the list it was me, but I'm not.
Go for it. Go for it. Thank you. Thank you, Jessica.
Okay. Thanks, Daniela, for organizing this. I know how incredibly useful it is to have these conversations. And I just want to underscore that I'm not representing any particular journal here. I've worked with several journals in my career so far. I am probably representing the humanities more than the social sciences. So I hope that my comments are applicable across different fields, but they are informed by work on humanistic journals and principally journals that publish work prior to about 17 or 1800. The first comment I wanted to make is about fit, which is obviously something that authors want to be considering before they even submit work to a given journal, but it's also worth considering when you get a decision from a journal, especially if the decision is not a positive one, because it can be very helpful and also a bit therapeutic to consider, whether a rejection or perhaps extensive revisions are because of a lack of fit for a particular journal, or whether they really have to do with the content and argument of your work. In some cases, a rejection based on fit, even if the journal editor doesn't use that term in her or his rejection, is a happy situation because it means that you can probably walk that same article somewhere else with minimal revision if you can find a journal that has a good fit. And so I'll be happy to talk more about fit in the Q&A, but for now I'll just say that. I want to comment mainly on the revise and resubmit, because I think this is the trickiest kind of decision to respond to know whether to revise, how to revise, and what it means to get a revise and resubmit. So the first piece of advice I can give is that if you can find out anything about what a revise and resubmit means at a particular journal, that is incredibly helpful. Journals range from accepting almost all of the articles to which they issue, for which they issue revise and resubmits. Other journals really don't, and which is an unfortunate situation, I think, but a revise and resubmit, can in some rare cases be a kind of soft rejection. If you feel comfortable approaching an editor, I think it's very legitimate to ask, can you tell me the number of revise and resubmits that end up as publications in this journal? And I think particularly in an era where we're all stressing transparency, it's very fair to ask that question. If you don't feel comfortable asking that question, you might ask a more senior scholar who has a good knowledge of that journal to, give you some insight into how that journal functions. The last thing you want to do is spend a lot of time revising an essay for publication, only to find out that you've done all the work and you still don't have the positive response. And I should say that in my experience, this is a fairly rare occurrence, but it does vary from field to field and discipline to discipline. Two very common and challenging situations that arise with revise and resubmits, and that also may arrive with provisional acceptances to a journal. One is when you are publishing interdisciplinary work, particularly in a broad interdisciplinary journal, and Renaissance Quarterly is one example of such a journal, but there are many in different fields. It's important to be aware from the beginning of the process that when you are submitting work to an interdisciplinary journal, your work is likely going to be vetted by scholars in different disciplines. And this is not true if you publish in a discipline-specific, very specialized journal, even if your own work is highly interdisciplinary. And so it can be harder to pass muster with scholars in different disciplines who may have different ways of wanting you to frame an argument. They may expect you to engage with a different group of critics and may fault you for not engaging with a particular body of work. So what I generally advise is sort of you really have to know the disciplines you're wading into, and get a sense not just for the content and argument, but also in some cases the style of writing that prevails in that discipline, because there are some differences, say, between literary history and art history and history of science that can become apparent to reviewers in different fields. And that's often when reviewers can become critical of someone coming from outside the discipline who is, sort of not engaging at the same level with a subject that someone would be able to engage in from within that discipline. So it's worth considering for each piece of work you publish or consider publishing, whether it's the kind of work that you really sort of are able to do and can do the work to, be reviewed by scholars across different disciplines. And I should say, in my own experience, some of my work goes that route and some of it doesn't and gets published really for an audience of literary historians. The other common and sometimes really vexing problem that can result, and again, can result especially with a revise and resubmit, but can also result with other verdicts from journal editors, is when you get two different reviewers with conflicting reviews on your work. And of course, it's human nature to want to privilege the more positive review over the negative one, and to think that the negative reviewer maybe doesn't grasp the work as well. And that can sometimes be the case. One piece of advice, again, that works if you're comfortable sitting down with the editor of the journal, or maybe just having an email exchange with the journal, is to ask for the journal editor's advice on negotiating conflicting reviews. Maybe one is much more positive and one is more critical, but I'll have other examples of conflicting reviews that I'll get to in a moment. I think a really responsible journal editor, though it is an incredibly demanding job, and so not all editors are going to have time to do this, may want to sit down with an author, particularly if the piece is still under consideration, and guide the author a little bit towards understanding which parts of the reviews to privilege and which parts to privilege a little less. And so sometimes a decision by an editor, if it's an invitation to resubmit or a provisional acceptance, might contain some guidance that, again, you might ask for help from colleagues on how to parse that guidance. Sometimes it's phrased in very subtle ways. And what a lot of journal editors do is they might list the things that they definitely want you to do, and then sort of they're leaving the rest out in the open for you to decide whether or not you actually want to undertake all the revisions recommended by both reviewers or all three reviewers, or whether you simply want to do the things that are the must-do revisions. Oftentimes I found on the inside of the process as an editor that reviews look conflicting to authors more than they do to editors, by which I mean two reviews might try to solve a similar problem in different ways. And so reviewer one might ask you to remove something, whereas reviewer two asks you to revise that same thing. And there you have a situation where you have two reviewers who both see a problem in the structure or the argumentation, But they're just coming up with different solutions, as different minds are wont to do. And so again, it's very helpful to have outside guidance from a mentor, from a seasoned scholar who can look more dispassionately at the reviews you've gotten and be able to sort out what to do, right? Not, maybe to discount one review at the expense of the other, but to point out that they're trying to get to the same end by two different means. One more point that I will make, and again, I can't speak with authority on how common this is, but because there are a lot of jokes running around academia about reviewer two, I did want to make a kind of a reviewer two observation, and that is that sometimes reviewer two is the editor. We are in an era where it's becoming increasingly difficult to find reviewers willing to review work for journals as well as for presses, and the editor will sometimes step in, and we hope that the editor has the expertise and experience to step in as a reviewer when a second reviewer perhaps can't be obtained, when a second reviewer might not come through with a review in a timely manner. And so I think there's real insight and truth to the fact that reviewer two often does seem a bit less informed, perhaps less expert on the material, more focused maybe on macro issues of structure and argumentation than on the content or what you're citing in your article. And it's, I think, useful to know that, if you get a second review for a journal article that is a little, I don't know, a little peculiar, that might be what's going on. It might also not be, but it is a possibility, and it's a sad reflection in a way of the fact that we're all working so hard that we don't have time to put to journal reviews. So I will leave things there.
Let me just pick up. I think that was wonderful. So let me just pick up where that left off. First of all, I try not to be reviewer two as much as possible. I think that's not an ideal situation, and it's really a matter of last resort. I don't know at the percentage of times that I am reviewer two or three. In some cases, we prefer to have 3 reviews. So I was tasked with a set of topics around sort of constructive responses to reviews and to the editorial process. And the first thing I want to say is it's really important to develop strategies for constructive responses. You are presumably trying to publish something to get it read. The journal has commissioned 2 or 3 people who it thinks are good or at least decent readers of this piece. They have that task, which means that they're actually they should be going through it from beginning to end. And so they're in a sense kind of a model reader for you. These are people who are going to read it and not drop it after the first paragraph, but make it all the way to the end. And so if they're not responding the way that you would have liked them to respond, then you should be thinking about how it is that I could have got them to respond the way that I wanted them to respond. So I think it's really important to read things constructively. In addition, if you're at the point where you're responding to reviewers and editors, then things are good. This is actually generally a good situation. Agreed that many journals are different, but here's a situation. So the journal I edit, Social Studies of Science, we desk reject approximately 80% of submissions. That is, reject without review 80% of submissions, which I think is a service to both authors and reviewers. So we're in that ballpark. Of the remaining ones, though, the majority, perhaps a little more than half of them, are going to get published in the journal. So they're going to make it through. And so if you're responding, then you are responding to something that is it was positive enough to get at a revise and resubmit or an accept with revisions kind of verdict, and you made it through the desk reject. So this is actually a really great situation. yes, there are journals that have other practices. I submitted once to a journal um, and was told to revise and resubmit my thing, but with the editor saying we have very little hope of this being published. And I thought, well, what is the point of that? Especially since I didn't actually think that I could answer some of the questions, which were perfectly good questions, but I didn't think I could respond to them. But with very little hope, what then? Well, that's kind of a miserable situation. And then I learned later that this was the journal's standard practice, actually, that they issued revise and resubmit verdicts to almost everything that they sent out for review, and indeed planned on rejecting most of those. So, so you're in a great situation. So now to the question is, so how can we respond? How can you respond well? So in terms of the nuts and bolts, the first thing that I would encourage everybody to do is to read the reviews and the editor's comments, and then put them aside. Just try not to tackle them that day. 24 hours later is a minimum. 48 is better, and so on and so forth. Just put them aside. This is hard. This is hard for authors. It's very, very hard for authors to see criticism of their work. And even if, as I want to say, that this criticism is valuable information for you one way or another, it is really difficult. So don't try to find ways of not being emotional. When you do come back to the reviews, try to group all of the concerns in different categories, and there might be thematic categories, there might be sections of the paper categories. Jessica mentioned, for example, if two reviewers may be trying to address the same issue in different ways, that might have to do with a particular section of the paper. So think about how to group all of the concerns or criticisms and the commendations too. Just try to put those into categories. This is actually useful for the editor too, because the editor may not have always seen what you know the paper better than the editor does. So the editor may not have seen some of the ways in which the reviewers are actually trying to address the same thing. So do that work and put it in category. I actually recommend doing it on a chart, so that you can put sort of concerned and put the two reviewers together. Don't do everything sequentially, and try to capture the major issues and abstract away from little details. Little details can bug you, but that's not necessarily what's important. And again, the editor is not likely to be focusing on every last detail. The editor would probably like to see your analysis of the larger issues. Try to be honest. Again, this is a constructive process. We're trying to make the papers better. Incidentally, I think peer review is a very poor mechanism for making decisions about accepting and rejecting manuscripts. It is a good way of improving manuscripts. And so what I usually, my slogan is, reviewers recommend and analyze, editors make decisions. And so that the editor's decisions can be quite different from what the reviewers would recommend. So okay, so develop this strategy, group things together, help the editor out, but be honest about this. There's nothing that irritates an editor more than an author who comes along and says, the reviewers both say wonderfully positive things about all of my paper, and I'm just going to deal with these little tweaks along the way, and the editor knows, when the editor knows that that's not the case. Okay. So then writing a response, including summaries of actions. So when you come to write that response, you can use the chart that you've created with the different categories, and somewhere else on that chart is how you would respond to then, I would generally in the humanities and social sciences, but it's perhaps in some of the social sciences it might be different, turn that back into prose. Help, paragraphs, these are the issues, that the major issues I see, this is how I have dealt with them. And that should be fairly straightforward. Be polite about the reviewers. If they didn't get something, if they didn't understand something, that's probably on you. So you need to figure out how to how to improve the manuscript, and then how you can communicate that improvement to the editors so that they will have a different view. If you're lucky, I do this a lot, the editor won't even send it out to the reviewers again. Different journals have different practices, but I really try to stand in for reviewers as much as possible. Reviewer time is very valuable. I try not to use it. Try not to use it too casually. So I will try to step in. And if you're lucky, that might speed things up. Or if the editor is very backlogged, it might slow things down. Okay, I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Sergio. Jessica is going to come back to address one more topic.
Right. So we're addressing the topics that we had hoped our third panelist would be able to address. And just a few more comments about, if you experience the unfortunate rejections that we all experience during our careers, particularly important to give it time, as Sergio is saying, not to read it right away, jump on it right away, react to it right away. Again, I find a second pair of eyes from someone I trust in my field incredibly helpful. The negative parts of a rejection never look as negative to anyone who is not you. And so a good reader and a good friend can often help you identify things that reviewers are saying that are very constructive, that are positive about your work, that are giving you a sense of direction about where to go with it next. And I know, there are some people who feel like you have to pick yourself up right away and send the essay out to a new journal, but I am in favor of giving it a little time and letting the wounds of the rejection heal before you decide what to do. And I would say, especially, in terms of responding to an editor who's given you a decision, try not to respond right away. I think the responses that I would get within an hour or two of sending out a decision tended to be over hasty in their responses to receiving reviews. And just one more comment on that note about corresponding with editors. If you are asked, particularly for a revise and resubmit, to give a list of the revisions that you've done, it's incredibly helpful to do a thorough and conscientious job with this work, even if you're not asked by an editor to just sum up the revisions that you've done. I found it invaluable precisely because it does take time and reviewers time to send a revised essay back to reviewers afterwards. So I think it's a courtesy to the editor to say, I took these reviews very seriously. I did my best. And even if you don't do everything that both reviewers or all three reviewers asked you to do, to say, well, I fixed this, but not in quite the same way as I was asked to. And that can be helpful to know as well. So I will leave it there.
Sergio, do you want to add anything at this point?
Sure, I'll just say a couple of words. One is, you can sometimes see the need for time. When I remember I've had a few times when I've had disagreements with authors and they've started responding right away. And then I just, as editor, I have increased the length of time between my responses on every occasion. So it starts with being a day, and then it becomes 2 days and 3 days. And then that's in an attempt from me to kind of enforce people to do that. I could talk about various other things about sort of hostile things, but I think maybe it would be better to open it up to the floor.
Yeah, that sounds good. We can open it up for questions. Please use your reaction hand to indicate when you have a question. I think that one thing that came through for me very vividly from both of your comments is that authors often think about editors and peer reviewers as gatekeepers, as sort of obstacles standing between them and publication. And what you're very helpfully signaling to us is the editors want strong papers for their journals. They don't want every paper, but they're actually the people who are going to help you publish a good paper. And the peer reviewers, so instead of gatekeepers are sort of shepherds, and the peer reviewers are not these hostile ogres who don't like your work and don't say you're brilliant. They're the people who have volunteered their time for no pay to engage very carefully with your essay. And that's because the title, the abstract that the authors sent to them, pleading, would you please, please, please review this? They have taken a look and said, these look so intriguing that I will add this to my schedule just because I want to read this manuscript. So it may not feel like that, but they are actually people who are helping you publish good work. Is that a fair characterization, sort of a flipping of the monsters into, I mean, not devils into angels, but, you know, something?
I think so. I think when I accept an article review or a book to review, a book manuscript, it's because I really expect to like the scholarship. And it can be disappointing, you know, when you think, oh, I had such high hopes for this. And here are some ways I think it can be improved. But I think it's very, very rare for someone to take on a review because they're aiming to prevent something from getting published.
So we have two hands. The first person is Vita.
Thank you. I apologize for not having my video on, but I want to thank you all for the wonderful advice that you're giving us. I was wondering if you could speak a little bit more about disagreeing with reviewers, and without really, you know, getting too specific on it. Say one reviewer is very interested in a component of the research and wants you to expand, and it's something you feel deeply about as well, and the second reviewer says get rid of it. So if anything you could say of how to politely disagree, that'd be great to hear.
So I'll jump in here. I think that the first thing to do is to step back and think about what your own goals for the manuscript, the paper, are. Think about what your central messages and the central flow of things, or whatever ways you want to envision this manuscript. That would, I think, then you can try to place the disagreement in that context. And maybe sometimes you're going to want to change what you originally thought was central, but that's probably not the case. But when I'm talking about something central, I'm talking about the sort of the core thesis, the central narrative, whatever that is, not, you know, not the point that you want to make in each section. So then you can try to make the case to the editor that the thing that reviewer 2, let's say, in the caricature, dislikes is actually crucial to the overall manuscript, not just to something that you held dear at the time. So that's all of this is very contextual. I mean, every case is going to be slightly different from every other case, but I think thinking of the manuscript as a whole, the paper as a whole, is the way to start working that through.
That's wonderful. And if I can just add one thing to that, I think that if I were to receive reviews of something that I wrote where one reviewer wants more of something and the other one wants less, I would read that now with the experience I have of being a structural problem, or a sense that readers don't really know what the core of the article is supposed to be yet, and that I haven't made that clear. And so that they're, one is frustrated that it's not going more in one direction, and the other just feels like you need to leave that direction behind. And but I also think gut instinct is so important. I mean, all of you know your own work better than anyone else. And so if you think that one reviewer's advice is much better than the other, I think that's a very good sign that you want to follow that advice.
The next question is from Jacqueline.
Hi, so I just wanted to say again, thank you so much for this event. So my question kind of builds off of that last question about responding to reviewers that you disagree with. And particularly this, a journal I submitted to recently, I got kind of a hostile review from, and that person recommended that my article not be published in the journal, but when the editor sent me the reviewer comments, they said that the article had shown promise and suggested to revise and resubmit. But what was interesting about this journal that hadn't occurred with other articles I submitted to other journals was that they require, or they don't require, but they offer kind of a formal response to the reviewer, and not just the response that would be submitted to the editors. And so I'm wondering, you talked about how the reviewers don't make the decision. So I'm wondering to what extent I should really try and convince that reviewer as a reader if the editor is asking me to resubmit. And then this also kind of piggybacks on a second question I have, which is what you really look for in a constructive review from the reviewer side, now that I've been doing a few of those too. Is it more structural, content issues, both? Because I think it's really important now, having received a negative review, to be able to give a constructive review that will help the writer to improve in a constructive way. And I'll finally say that I also second Isaac's question, which is in the chat, and I think Daniela said she would read that. But yeah, so thank you.
Yeah, I mean, the situation you're describing is unusual. It's unfamiliar to me, where an author would be expected to respond to a reviewer, and it may have something to do with the decision-making structure of that particular journal. Some readers are not convincible, and I don't think, I don't think it's necessarily the job of editors to only publish work that is convincing to everyone, because that can result in some fields in work that's bland, work that's, something that's easy to accept as true is perhaps likely to be less provocative. So it sounds like in your situation, maybe the editor is a little more on your side than one of the reviewers. And that's a good thing, because ultimately in most journals, editors are the ones making decisions. But it's also, useful to get a sense of what, how decisions are being made at different journals. Some editorial boards are very active and they sit down and make decisions as a group. Other times you have one editor or a few editors in charge of the decision. So without knowing more, I'm loath to give you advice on your situation, and I'll turn things over to Sergio.
Can I just ask you, Jessica, before Sergio responds, is this one of the situations where you might ask to chat with the editor just for a quick phone call or some guidance over email and just see what they...
I think it would be perfectly fair to say, because I've never been asked to write something like this before, can you offer any guidance as to the form, the length? Do you have a model for this? And especially in what is an unusual situation where you're being asked to do something that is not a norm for humanities or social science journals.
On the other side, the reviewer question, I'm going to give essentially the same answer as I gave to the author question. The best reviewers should try to figure out what the author wants to do, and figure out that central core thing that the author wants to do, and to help the author think about that, to help the author convey that best. Very few reviewers are going to really be able to put in the time to do this well, but in my feeling that's the ideal. The ideal is the core point that the author wants to make. What is preventing them from making it as well as they could possibly make it? And that's what I would like to see in reviews. I also, of course, as an editor, I also want to see reviewers who, of course, know more about the material than I know, and who can say, look, the author ought to look at this other thing or whatever. This, there's an alternate interpretation of something. That's all important too. So I don't want to say it's central point above all else, but that's ideal. The same sort of thing that you would do if you were advising a student of how to improve their written work, right? So just think about the central points and then help them out with all the details.
Thank you both. The next question was posted on the chat, and so I will just read it. Thank you very much for these reflections. Would the speakers share any thoughts on book manuscript review in contrast or comparison with the article review process?
Would you like me to start on this, or would you? Okay. Because reviewing a book manuscript is an even greater investment of time and energy than reviewing an article manuscript, I think you can assume even more persuasively that the readers who are secured by a press are going to be very interested and invested in the book manuscript. That if it's the 1 or 2 or 3 book manuscripts they are going to accept that year for review, they're interested in the project, and they will hopefully take the project on its own terms, right? To be that good reviewer who wants to make your project the best it can be. I think one of the key differences, it seems to me anyway, that editors at presses already have formulated a fairly confident decision about what they want even before they secure reviews. And I don't know the statistics, going on from press to press, but that manuscripts that go under full review tend to fare quite well for that reason. That a press is not going to invest a huge amount of time into securing full reviews of a full book manuscript rather than a proposal or a précis if they're not fairly confident that the work is something that they want, that it fits well with their series or their press and so forth. The other difference is that revisions can be incredibly lengthy and involved for a book manuscript. It's not unusual to spend a year revising a book manuscript, going off and doing new research. So that I think one has to be prepared. Obviously, if tenure is a consideration, especially be very prepared for extensive revisions from reviewers, extensive revisions to get in line with house style and so forth. And I've known some scholars who've been sort of unpleasantly surprised when they find out how much work it's going to take to revise a book that they thought was almost done.
I'll add to the complexity of the responding to a set of book reviews of a book manuscript, and is that your audience has now increased dramatically in your response. You have the acquisitions editor who is not going to be an expert in the material, almost certainly is not going to be an expert at the level at which a journal editor is going to be an expert in your material. I mean, these are gradations, but almost certainly not. But then in addition to that, most academic presses will also have some kind of board, that needs to read this, and that's a group of academics who span all sorts of different disciplines and so on and so forth. So when you're writing your responses, when you're especially that document, the response document, for a book manuscript, it needs to be addressed to this very general audience so that the audience can really understand what you're doing without knowing anything about the field in particular. So it is a very tricky thing, and because of the time commitments on all sides, it's worth taking some real time to do it well. And if you do it well, it probably will improve the book manuscript too. It will probably make it more readable, because you will have to have thought about what this more generic audience will understand in your response.
Thank you very much. The next question is from Sureka.
Thank you very much for this session. It's been fascinating and encouraging. So I have a question about contradictory recommendations. It's one of those kind of classic, one positive, one very positive, one negative, but likes the thing I thought everybody would hate, and therefore I put it in secretly at the end and said, like, why, so great, I get to bring forward the thing that I thought would be the thing nobody liked. But I suppose I'm now a little paranoid about how to revise for the one who wanted the structure revised without confusing the person who actually said the structure was exemplary and the essay was a model of clarity. Maybe this is just a case of, maybe there's a simple thing to do is to look for the simplest way to fix it so that you don't actually make it worse for one of the other readers.
You could, oh, sorry, Jessica.
No, please go ahead. I will answer second.
You could consider that you have multiple manuscripts here, that you have something that is really valuable, that the thing that you loved that you thought everybody would hate, maybe you're still right to love it. You got somebody else to love it, but maybe that doesn't belong in this manuscript. That's I say this not knowing anything about the context or anything like that.
Even though that's the thing that the skeptical reviewer wished was framing this.
But it sounds to me like you're not going to rewrite your entire manuscript.
Oh, I rewrite things all the time. It's just, I mean, not rewrite, but like restructure. I mean, that's just eating cake. I suppose I don't want to get in my own way, worrying that I will make the person who thought it was really good disappointed. I mean, reading between the lines of the editorial report, which really was a model of clarity and helpfulness of the sort you laid out, it sounds like it is going back out, or well, there'll be reviewers. So perhaps I can ask, whether it will go, to at least two of these, since it is putting me off, kind of wondering whether I'll make it worse for the one who already likes it.
Yeah, I might ask the editor for some guidance. When one reviewer thinks the structure is exemplary and the argument is clear and isn't struggling to figure out, what is this article about, and the other one seems to be struggling, I think it's a difference in taste, that some scholars really like an argument to be very, very clearly signposted. They want the thesis on page 1. They want transitions between sections to be absolutely crystal clear. Other reviewers, other readers want something that's a little more essayistic and meandering, right? And these are, I think, standards that vary from field to field, from discipline to discipline. I'm sure that humanities and social sciences are quite different on this count. Some reviewers have more patience to wait for an argument to unfold in stages. And that might be what you're seeing here.
Yeah, thank you. That's helpful. I'll just stop worrying that I will make the people who already like it decide they hate it.
While questions come, I'll just maybe ask you both a bit about this, because it is always this question of strategy, right? Any article could become 3 or 4 different articles, and part of the question is, where are you at? What can you do? How do you choose which version? Partly on intellectual basis, and partly on, if you're up for tenure or if you're in the job market, you may not have a year to turn this into. So it does sound like you are suggesting that talking to the editor might offer sort of a way to chart your path. Yes, you are saying that. What about talking to the editor before you submit? Because it occurs to me that some of what you both have said is about fit, about the sort of the vision that the editors have for the journal, about how that specific journal, like what their proportion of rejections and revise and resubmit. So do you recommend, especially for junior scholars, that they just check in with the editor saying, I am working on this, might this be of interest, and sort of like pre-game it, or is that not a good idea?
So I'll say that I feel that it's not a good idea. It's very difficult for editors to make decisions on the basis of a short description of something that may not even be final, may not have its final form. That's really, really difficult. So you might get, say, positive signals from an editor that aren't really as warranted as otherwise. But the main reason, I think, is if you are writing in a field, you should have a sense of which journals that you're writing for. The majority of the articles that I desk reject are their articles from people who are outside the fields that are represented by the journal I edit, and they just don't know what they're sending it into. So I think you should know that in advance, which means that the journal in question should be one that you're reading articles from on a regular basis, and you should already have a sense of that this is the right kind of thing. It still could be rejected on the basis of fit. That's not a guarantee, or something that you might read as a matter of fit. It could be, I routinely say things to the effect of, for this journal, we would hope for a conclusion, for a thesis that was more general or abstract than the one that's being offered, or something like that, which is a matter of fit, not on topic, not on style, but on what is being accomplished by the article. But it might work perfectly well in a more specialized journal on that topic, say a journal of the history of that topic, whatever it is, might work really well if it's providing new information. But if it's not, anyway, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So it's the fit is going to come back.
I tend to agree. I was often worried about misleading someone by saying, yes, that sounds great, please send it our way. And then, of course, when you see it, sometimes you realize, no, this is not a good fit. The scope isn't right. The other issues that would not make it a good fit for a particular journal. And it's just very hard to tell until you see the work itself, rather than a paragraph long description of the work. And one more point on that count, and this was something I did not realize until I edited a journal. The abstract that most journals ask you to write when you submit an article to a journal, it really matters. And it's, of course, often the last thing we write. It's the thing we write at 11:58 p.m. before we're determined to press send and get this thing off of our desk before morning. And it matters in part because it's the thing that is supposed to lure reviewers, right? A lot of journals, when they contact reviewers, will send just the abstract. of the essay and say, is this something you're interested in reading? And so it should be written in a really lively, engaging manner. It should be enticing. And I find often abstracts are just, kind of a little rigid and dull. So, and they're hard to write. So I know that's a tall order to write a really inviting abstract.
But I can add one more thing to that. Please also just be aware that editors spend a lot of time on this. For the past decade, don't tell my university this, I have spent something like between 60 and 70% of my working hours editing this journal. And the university thinks it is closer to 25 to 30 or something like that. But anyway, so that means that has a couple of implications for you as authors. One is please don't, please just respect the time. But the other is we can let things slide very easily if they're not coming in through the usual channels. If they're not entering the proper flow at the beginning of the process, it's very easy for us to lose things. So when somebody sends a full manuscript to me, says, can you evaluate this? Well, I do try to, just in case it's an absolute non-starter. But if it has some possibility, I just tell them, please submit it as usual. This is more guaranteed not to get lost in my email inbox, which is a horrible box.
Aren't they all? I mean, I don't know. There's a question on the chat, and I think after that we will have just time for closing comments, and I do want to ask you something to frame those. So the question in the chat is, when a situation when a reviewer is less civilized than you would like them to be, when a review is more of a personal attack than a piece of constructive criticism.
I have a few things to say about that. I'm sorry that I can't be more concrete and specific in my answer, but these are rare situations, and they're often, I think, not what we would presume them to be, in that reviewers also have feelings. And the few times that I've seen a reviewer, whether for an article manuscript, a book manuscript, get personal or testy is, I think, when the reviewer's feelings are involved, when the author has failed to cite the reviewer, when the author is dismissive of some aspect of the reviewer's work or the field in which the reviewer works. So oftentimes, surprisingly, these revolve less around race or gender than they do about generational divides, where a young scholar suddenly comes in with this brilliant article, but it is ignoring a previous generation of scholarship. So there's these sensitive areas around questions of indebtedness. And I think there's been a set of cultural shifts in the way that maybe scholars of a younger generation don't quite show indebtedness, and do homage to genealogies in the way that scholars of former generations once did. So again, very rare, even reading between the lines of the many, many reviews that crossed my desk, but often a lack of civility, I think, can come out of hurt feelings, and sometimes impatience with sloppiness, with a lot of small errors. And again, I mean, reviewers run the gamut in terms of their temperaments. But I think sometimes I've seen where a reviewer might lose patience in the middle of reviewing an essay because there's a lot that this reviewer feels, needs to be corrected.
Sergio, do you want to come in on this?
In these cases, I would encourage you to turn the other cheek as much as you possibly can. I remember the very first article that I sent to a real journal. I got a review that said, this is okay as far as it goes, but it's clearly written by a graduate student, and I don't think you should publish it, which was almost the entire content of the review. I feel very fortunate that I was able to just say, okay, this is really inappropriate, but that's okay. Let's just focus on everything else that's going on here. Focus on the other reviews, or focus on what the editor has said, and just leave it at that. Even though it was so, yeah. But I agree with Jessica that that's not a common situation. It comes up, and I do have to sometimes apologize to authors. I sometimes write a note that says, look, I apologize for what this reviewer is saying, but I think that they have something useful to say buried in here. And then in the rare case, I actually just retract the review because it's too rude. But none of this is all that common. And last point, authors may be inclined to perceive something as less civilized than it is actually. Sometimes people are just a little blunt. They're just being direct. And I'm not saying that that's the case for this questioner. I mean, this question might be coming out of a real bad experience, and I apologize for that from the point of view of editors and senior scholars, but it can be a matter of perception sometimes.
Thank you both. We are at time. So I want to say you're obviously both models of editorial rigor and generosity. And I have learned so much, as I am sure so many here have. Thank you so much, Sergio Sismondo, Jessica Wolfe, for sharing your advice and feedback with us. Thank you everyone who came and for your questions. I just want to note our next How to workshop will be on November 14th, how to cultivate a network of mentors with speakers talking about mentorship at different stages of a scholar's career. So thank you so much, and until next time.